Reviving and improving Indigenous information or Indigenous knowledge structures has gained official recognition and support during the new partnership with African Development, which is NEPAD. The Northwest University has a collaboration with NEPAD in terms of preserving and protecting the Indigenous knowledge. When you go to the Northwest University, you would see that the institution, there is a big board there where it's written that this is a NEPAD region, whereby the Northwest University is one of the main centers of NEPAD. A National Indigenous Knowledge Systems policy was established in 2004. Most of us are aware of the IKS policy that speaks of the preservation, protection, and dissemination of Indigenous knowledge, and speaks that communities should benefit from their own knowledge, and also speaks of women in participating in commercialization of Indigenous knowledge, being main or key participants of the Indigenous knowledge. So it was very important for this policy to be established. And amongst its goals, there are development of a system for documenting Indigenous knowledge, the promotion based on small enterprises, and the defense of Indigenous knowledge under South African intellectual property law. Now, communities for a very long time also have had their own ways of managing Indigenous knowledge. They have their own techniques that they use in protecting this knowledge, and these techniques have been shared from one generation to another. Now, as far as traditional medicine is concerned, traditional leaders, they work with traditional health practitioners. Of course, we all know that in South Africa, we have different traditional health practitioners, but those who handle traditional medicine mostly are diviners and herbalists. So traditional leaders, they have worked and established customary laws and taboos associated with the usage of this knowledge. So therefore, it means that not everyone is allowed to utilize this knowledge, and they respect these customary laws, hence why this knowledge has been managed in this way for a very long time. So again, spirituality, or let me say the ancestors, they play a vital role in the management of this knowledge within communities, because it is known in communities that if you use certain medicinal plants, or if you go to a certain bush and try to take certain plants, you are going to get punished by the ancestors. You are going to face certain consequences. So certain members of the communities will not go to a certain land. They will respect it as a sacred land of the ancestors, because they have been taught for a long time, and they have taught their children also that certain bushes are not, you do not go there. There is certain medicine that is only accessed by herbalists and traditional leaders, or by also diviners. So this is a way of protecting this knowledge or this medicine from being stolen or being misused. That those are Indigenous ways of managing the knowledge. Now, in South Africa, many plants, are reported as raw, or they are semi-processed and then later packaged without the acknowledgement of the custodians of the knowledge. So most Indigenous communities, even today, even when there are policies and laws, they still suffer from this, whereby they don't benefit from their Indigenous knowledge. You get certain companies say that this is just a wild plant. They found it in land that doesn't belong to anyone, and therefore they package it and commercialize commercialize this knowledge. One of the main examples that most of us know about is the Hoodia plant of the Khoi people. We all we all know about how they were exploited, and at some point they had to fight for their knowledge. They had to go through courts until around 2002, when even the San the San committee was then established to represent the people, and they won the case. And of course, they were given certain percentages of the hudia from what they've benefited, but it wasn't enough, and they had to take whatever that was given to them. So that on its own was a lesson to many institutions that this knowledge is not knowledge that this knowledge is protected and it belongs to certain communities. So you cannot just go to a certain community and take something that belongs to them and commercialize it and sell its rights to other companies, and without the community benefiting. So this was more like a groundbreaking point for indigenous communities in terms of this, hudia was used as an example and a lesson by so many institutions that from thereforth, they should work with communities, they should work towards commercialization of this knowledge, working with communities in order to avoid being dragged to the court of law, in order to avoid, their reputation being ruined, and in order to avoid conflicts and disputes that, that could affect their business as well as affect the indigenous communities. Like I've explained that, there was a dispute until 2002 where the Sen's contribution on traditional medicine was acknowledged. Traditional medicine, for example, were promised to be investigated for efficacy, safety, and quality with a view of incorporating their use in the health system as early in the 1996 in South Africa by the National Drug Policy. And then the National Drug Policy also states that marketed traditional medicine will be registered and controlled, which has not yet happened, even though it is there, but it is a very slow process. So many indigenous communities are still suffering even now. So many are waiting on government, and so many do not even know which channels to follow in order to make their knowledge, protected and recognized in order for them not to be exploited. So I think another challenge here is that the policies are there and the institutions are there, but the lack of engagement is also present because people have this knowledge, but they are vulnerable. They do not know where to go to. And when they're approached by these companies because they do not understand the laws of South Africa, certain individuals are excluded and removed from the entire community. Then they are bribed or they're given money to so that certain companies, the third party, could take away the knowledge. So basically what they do, they identify certain powerful people within the community, which will influence the rest of the community. Then they give them certain percentages, which of course is not enough. Therefore, because our people, they don't understand, they don't even know about the ICAS policy, they don't even know about CSIR, DST, Arts and Culture, ARC, and all other institutions that protect this knowledge. They take as little as, I don't know, I've never experienced that, but it's not enough and it doesn't sustain them over the years. So most of the time, it's just once-off payments, which of course, they don't even have anything written on paper that they will benefit over the years. Rather, they just sign to show that, of course, we have agreed that this plant could be taken for future research and exploration. So those are the challenges. Our people, most of indigenous custodians who are elders, they lack formal education. So when people who are third parties come to indigenous communities and promising them the world, what they do based on poverty and other factors, they sign certain agreements which they don't know how much they're binding. That is another challenge that indigenous communities face. So the South African government does have institutions like I've mentioned, the ARC, the CSIR, MRC, and Department of Science and Technology. We have the NRF, we have the National Recordal System, and the NICSO, which is the National Indigenous Knowledge Systems Office, that are working with government in order to protect this knowledge and to make sure that Indigenous communities, of course, they benefit from this knowledge, and that this knowledge is properly managed and commercialized, and the benefit sharing agreement is always there. Like I've said to you, that one of the issues that are currently existing is that I don't know whether it's the bottom-up approach, but what I'm just trying to say is that Indigenous communities, they're not aware of these institutions. Nobody, or most of the time, people do not go, or professionals do not go underground. They do not go to the settlements of Indigenous people and explain their rights and explain what the benefit sharing agreement is and explain the roles of these institutions and make a pathway for them to directly be connected with the community. So most of the time the community finds itself vulnerable. They don't know which channels to follow. They don't even know how to, most of them who are custodians of this knowledge, they don't even know what is an email, what is an office number, and they end up selling, or they end up benefiting less or being exploited by people who have interest in commercializing their knowledge. So this paper focused on the protection, preservation, and management of Indigenous knowledge systems, specifically looking at traditional medicine and looking at the role of the community and the role of different institutions and how different policies and laws have been established in South Africa in terms of protecting this knowledge. It also states the challenges that communities are facing. The challenges are, of course, like I said, that there are existing policies, but still the process is a bit slow. So there are people who are still exploited and who are still vulnerable. And it's very important that a way forward regarding this is, there should be a way forward. And also the institutions that have been mentioned before, they should have, I don't know, maybe some way of checking progress in terms of engaging with the communities, because the process of protecting Indigenous knowledge started before 2004. As I've said earlier, that there was a document, an act of 1996, I think it's 1996, but I know that before then, they have been, establishing ways to protect this knowledge. So if we're counting from 2004 until today, is at least approximately 17 years old, 17 years since the ICAS policy was established, but yet the process of engaging with communities, the process of making sure people are not exploited is very slow. And it's not only on traditional medicine, but Indigenous knowledge as a whole, it finds itself in a position whereby it's taken or sold or used by people who are not main custodians of such knowledge. So this is the problem that we have within South Africa, that of course there are currently laws, but these laws, are they strong enough, and are professionals who establish these laws also working with communities, forming structures that ensure that communities, they understand their rights, they understand what they should be benefiting from when it comes to their knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Koitsiwe and Ms. Buddha. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Ms. Buddha, I wonder if you could hand the hosting back to Tom.
I've taken it, and I've fixed the sharing issue as well. Everyone can share their screens now, so it should be fine for Maneo to carry on sharing her screen now.
Okay, Mrs. Rolabitso, I wonder if you could just try sharing your screen just to make sure we don't have any further technical issues. I'm sorry to everyone who's with us, if you could just bear with us. Luckily, we do only have 2 speakers for today, so we're not too pressed for time. Mrs. Rolabitso, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi. Actually, I'm making assumptions. Have you got a presentation to share, or are you just speaking with us today?
No, I have a presentation to share. But it seems I have the same issues as my colleagues who presented before me.
Interesting.
Okay. Or maybe.
Oh, no.
You'd be fine to share now. There we go.
Oh, is there?
It's there, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Right, to those who joined us now, sorry we couldn't let you in before. We had a problem with the sharing of the screens. That we had to make the presenter host. So I'm sorry if you waited for too long. Our apologies for that.
No, it's okay.
Okay, thank you for joining us, Mrs. Relabitso. Mrs. Relabitso we're thrilled to have her with us. She's a historian and a heritage practitioner who has for the last 8 years been manager of the Royal Archives and Museum at Matseng, Lesotho. And for the last 5 years, she's volunteered as a co-director of the Seriti Maharani Heritage and Tourism Community Initiative. In 2020, she completed a master's degree in history with the Department of Historical Studies at the National University of Lesotho, and her study was on traumatic experiences suffered by the Matebe or Mafeteng residents during the 1970 state of emergency in Lesotho. Her research interests include oral history, preservation of Indigenous knowledge systems, and uses of heritage in empowering rural communities. And her paper for us today is on decolonizing Basotho's preference of genetically modified plants over indigenous plants, selected examples from the Maharani cultural landscape. Before you begin, Mrs. Relabitso, can I just remind everyone that if you have questions, you're welcome to start writing them down now. We ask that questions are asked in the chat function so that I can start compiling them, and then at the end of our 2 sessions, I will put them to our speakers who will be able to respond then. So feel free to start writing your questions in the chat function as we go. Thank you so much, Mrs. Relabitso. We're excited to hear your paper.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Beth, and thank you, Tom. Good afternoon to the attendees. Well, I've been introduced, so without any further ado, I'll get into the paper, whose title is Decolonizing Basotho's Preference of Genetically Modified Plants over Indigenous Plants. And it will use selected examples from Maharani cultural landscape, which is where I work at. I don't know, I'm a historian, so you will see a lot of text, but I'll briefly introduce or briefly capture what the abstract is about. Now, this paper discusses a trend by Basotho to adopt planting or using genetically modified plants to the exclusion of indigenous plants, which have been used as food sources for generations. It applies decolonization discourse to understand this preference over indigenous plants. Sorry. The public literature on the decolonization has focused on the nature of decolonization in Lesotho, and there's currently no literature on decolonization of food culture in Lesotho. Although the literature that exists, as you will see in the coming slides, has been generated by botanists, scientists, and traditional healers. Now, this paper, it calls for decolonization of food arrangements, parity of food systems, and an inclusive approach to food regime in the Kingdom of Lesotho and beyond. Now, FAO, which is Food and Agriculture Organization, defines genetically modified food organisms as those plants whose genes have been altered technologically to make them resistant to climatic challenges, while it also defines indigenous plants as plants or foods that can be accessed locally without purchase. Sorry. Now, let me just introduce you a bit to Lesotho's ecology. There are 4 main ecological zones in Lesotho. We have the mountain areas with the altitude about 3,000 meters above sea level. And then we have the lowlands with altitude ranging between 1,400 meters and 1,800 meters above sea level. We have the foothills with altitude ranging between 1,800 meters to 2,800, to 2,000 meters above sea level. And then we have the last one as Senku River, which is the part flanking the Senku River and stretching into the highland. Sorry, okay. Now, when we talk about Lesotho's colonial history and heritage, okay, thank you. When we talk about Lesotho's colonial history and heritage, I think the key year was in 1833 when the missionaries arrived in Lesotho. These were the missionaries that were called by Maharani, the founder of Lesotho Nation, and they came to Lesotho in 1833. Now, this year set in motion the wheel of colonialism in Lesotho because the missionaries introduced Christianity to Lesotho, they introduced education, they introduced agriculture, new crops and technologies leading to commodification of crops. So we see a new culture being introduced to Lesotho by foreign element, if you like. Now, the second and most important year is 1868, which marks the year on which Lesotho was annexed as a British protectorate. Now, this was after numerous requests made by Maharani to the British government, working on the advice of the missionaries, to try and salvage the situation where Lesotho were having land disputes with the Boers and, of course, boundary disputes as well. So, at this point, we see a second influence on Lesotho culture emerging from the colonial administration. So during this time, colonial administration became superior, as for instance, the tenure of chiefs depended on them and no longer on the wishes of Lesotho. Now, Lesotho's way of life changed further as they were introduced to mercantile trade and migrant labor, which of course took place in South Africa. British colonial rule persisted in Lesotho until 1966, when Lesotho was declared independent. Now, I've in the introduction mentioned that there seems to be no available or no existing literature on decolonization of food in Lesotho. But the existing literature on decolonization focuses on the nature of decolonization in Lesotho, to the effect that Lesotho became independent through a constitutional process as opposed to an armed struggle, which happened in a number of Southern African countries, South Africa and others. However, the literature that is associated with the subject has been borrowed from other writers. In this instance, I'll cite Frantz Fanon, who, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, who defines colonialization or decolonization as the urgent need to challenge the colonial situation. He contends that decolonization is tantamount to putting the last first. He mentions that the sweeping nature of colonial domination quickly dislocated in striking fashion the cultural life of the conquered people. In this context, we're talking about Lesotho. Secondly, this paper borrows from contribution of Ngugiwa Thiong'o's Decolonizing Mind, which advocates for decolonizing language in Africa as a constructive tool in national culture, history, and identity. Lastly, Sam Gray and Raj Patel's article on food sovereignty, or article entitled Food Sovereignty as Decolonization, some contributions from indigenous movements to food system and development politics, which sought to show that food sovereignty is an ongoing struggle by the indigenous in post-colonial context. It sees indigenous food sovereignty as more than just agricultural practice. It is food generating practices coupled with activities aimed at maintaining the environment that are deeply embedded in cultural economy. On the other hand, as I have mentioned, the literature that is related to the subject of today, which has been published in Lesotho, has been basically on the flora of Lesotho. Now we have different, I have categorized this into different periods. We have the earliest contributors, which came from the European botanist Eric Percy Phillips, and we have the second. We had another contribution by a seconded ecologist, which was published in 1938 by R.R. Staples and Hudson. Now, in the post-colonial period, we had contribution from Jaco Guillemot, who was a descendant or son of one of the missionaries that arrived in Lesotho. Now, recent contributions have been from botanists, scientists, traditional healers, and ecologists, as I have shown. And their contribution basically is to show that the certain or specific indigenous plants are used as food sources and as medicine sources. Now, today, this paper seeks to explain why Basotho prefer genetically modified and exotic plants over indigenous ones. Now, it will explain that by showing the colonial link of this preference. It will look at typical answers from the respondents, which were interviewed, and they are residing at Maharani, and critically discuss their responses using decolonizing theory. Now, it will also talk about the lessons learned. In putting this paper together, archival and desktop research was conducted on published literature on decolonization of foodways in Lesotho and indigenous plants of Lesotho and exotic plants adopted by Basotho. This material was collected from the local research facilities at Mazieng Royal Archives, as well as Morija. Now, there were also interviews which complement the archival and desktop research, which were conducted. The interviews were conducted with people residing in villages around Mazieng, as well as Morija. I'm going to explain why Mazieng and Morija within the context of Maharani cultural landscape. It will come into the next slide. Now, Maharani is an area which was used as a case study because it is a cultural landscape which houses a lot of heritage related to missionaries and descendants of Moshoeshoe the First, as well as the British colonial rule. So Maharani is it's a bigger area, and within this bigger area we have Morija, we have Mazieng. Now, let me just read that slide. Maharani is an area where the French missionaries came, or who came to Lesotho in 1833, established their first mission station. These missionaries coexisted with the descendants and successors of Morena Moshoeshoe the First, the founder of Basotho Nation, whose royal homestays are also found in the area. By that, I mean the homestays of the sons of Moshoeshoe are found in the area and they came to stay there from 1833 until today. Now it has a rich natural, prehistoric, archaeological mission, royal and chieftainship history and heritage, literary, built heritage, as well as living culture. I suppose some of us know the well-renowned writer, Thomas Mofolo. Thomas Mofolo is from the same area. Now it is characterized by a legacy of an interaction between the traditional leaders and the missionaries on the one hand, the interaction of the traditional leaders and the colonial administrators on the other, and the traditional leaders in Basotho. Continuation on methods and methodology. The analysis of data is informed by the decolonizing theory of food and medicine. In this context, this theory seeks to unpack how colonialism has led to a preference of genetically modified and exotic plants over indigenous ones. Now, I'm getting into what the study unearthed, being the results, and they are grouped in terms of the subject. And the first aspect is knowledge. This is what the information which was collected from the respondents has shown. Now, the knowledge about indigenous plants uses as, sorry, I'll repeat that. The knowledge about indigenous plants uses as sources of food and medicine and their nutritional benefits is common among people aged 50 years and more. This is because they've had first-hand experience of this indigenous or use of indigenous plants through gathering them as children, preparing them when they're growing up, eating them and using them for medicinal purposes, and they continue to use them even today. Now, in recent times, people of this age group seldom use indigenous plants as sources of food due to the scarcity of the plants owing to changing ecological and climatic conditions. That speaks to the concept of cultural ecology, because they have had to adapt to the changing ecological conditions, and thus have opted to use genetically modified plants as sources of food, and they use those seasonally to complement their use of indigenous food or plants as sources of food or as sources of medicine. However, this knowledge is lacking amongst people aged 30 years and younger. The older generation has gradually ceased to share this knowledge because of the lack of interest, which has been shown by the younger generation. And this lack of interest can be explained as a far-reaching impact of colonialism. Basotho have ways and methods in which they preserved food. In this context, preservation of indigenous food. Now, the respondents aged 50 and more have knowledge of preservation methods which were used in the past to preserve indigenous plants so that they could continue to be used even in dry or winter season when the climatic conditions were not favorable for these plants to grow. And one such method included the drying of the leaves of these plants. I'll just make an example. There's a plant which is found in people's yards. You know, it grows around the houses, you know, and it's a natural plant. It's called tepe in Lesotho. I think its English name is pigweed. Now, this plant is a source of, it's used as a source of food. And it was also preserved by trying its young leaves, you know, as so that it can be used during dry seasons. Now, things have changed. The lack of food preservation methods among young generation have led to preference of genetically modified plants, which make them resistant to those climatic and other ecological challenges. It has emerged from, the subject here is inferiority versus superiority. It has emerged from the data collected that genetically modified plants are preferred over indigenous plants as sources of food based on the level of appreciation of food or food culture. Respondents aged less than 30 have lamented the fact that indigenous food tastes and does not look appetizing. Thus, the lasting impact of colonialism on the inferiority of indigenous and superiority of the foreign has been assimilated into their minds. They further mentioned that the preparation of indigenous food is boring. This is because it doesn't use exotic ingredients such as colorants and spices to bring out the aroma, which they find, you know, quite interesting. Similarly, or on the same wavelength, there's reluctance by the young generation to rely on plants as sources of medicine for healing purposes. They regard medically prescribed medicine as superior. You know, this kind of medicine that you get over the counter or you go to the clinic, it's prescribed to you. This is because the Western medical fraternity has been reluctant to accommodate, in quotes, the use of indigenous medicinal plants for ailments, including chronic diseases. I think a lot of Basotho have had experience in relying on indigenous methods to heal certain ailments. Now, the biggest reservation cited is that the quantity of these concoctions, in quotes, prescribed to be taken is unreliable as it has not been medically tested or quantified or properly quantified. And this is strongly opposed by a traditional herbalist whom I had a conversation with, who in the wake of COVID-19 lamented their exclusion as traditional healers from the fight against the virus, and of course is also negated by studies carried out by the ethnobotanists. I think my colleagues talked about Lengana there, and there's a lot of Lengana in Lesotho, which was used during the COVID pandemic. Now, the issue about language. The language or phrases associated with indigenous plants are manifestations of discrimination perpetuated by colonialism on food and medicine culture, that is on indigenous food and medicine culture. The respondents aged 50 and more have indicated that when they were children, mabele, which is sorghum, was used as a staple food and it was abundantly produced. Now in Sesotho, we have a metaphor that says, mabele ke ngwetsi ya malapa ohle, which means mabele could be found, or sorghum could be found in every household, every family. But this has changed over the years as maize has become a dominating staple food, which has kind of replaced mabele, or although not completely. Now, when asked why, one of the respondents mentioned that sorghum is very nutritional, especially for sick people and toddlers, as it improves their immunity. However, food made from sorghum is regarded as dark, unattractive, and looks scary on the plate. A continuation on the associated language. For instance, sorghum porridge is called sekwita. Sekwita is a dark and scary looking person who kills. Now, this associated language with staple foods or sorghum, continues to colonize our use or Basotho's use of indigenous plants as sources of food. Now, it's common in Lesotho for sorghum soft porridge to be given to nursing mothers, which induces lactation. And it's still the case even today, although the rate at which it's being produced has declined. On the other hand, the young mothers have expressed reservations about this use of sorghum porridge because they maintain that it leads to postpartum weight gain. Now, this means certain benefits of the sorghum porridge are being disregarded over weight gain. I suppose we decide what we eat. Now, this and other expressions have led to the shunning of sorghum food and indirectly glorified maize as it is white and looks better on the eye when put on the plate. This has seen the reduction of production of sorghum by farmers for subsistence and commercial use. The reduced demand has had a positive impact on the price of sorghum as it has become a rare commodity. Maize, on the other hand, has been popular and is widely produced, thus sells cheaper and faster. The next subject is food economy. There's a belief among people aged 30 years and younger that indigenous plants as sources of food are used by poor people as opposed to well-off families. This is because those who gather indigenous plants are regarded as being unable to afford costs to buy seeds or to buy sold crops from genetically modified and exotic plants. Now, there's a perception that the use of GMO and even exotic crops is a sign of sophistication and class. So if you're modernized, if you're civilized, if you've attained a certain level of education, you can't go to the fields and gather these indigenous plants. I'll proceed to the next slide. On that note of food economy, this is, okay, sorry, let me go back a bit. A handful of tepe, which is pigweed or bobatsi, now costs 5 malodi. Sorry about the typo. That is 5 rands, while a bunch of spinach costs 8 rands to 10 malodi. And one young respondent indicated that she would rather buy a handful of bobatsi than to go out and gather it. I think that speaks to civilized mentality. This is because they feel that they don't have time to go out and gather these plants, which are situated far from the villages in the fields, and they'd rather pay someone to go and collect that on their behalf. Now, colonialism has led to discord between people and environment. It emerged from the respondents aged less than 30 years that they no longer participate in cultural activities aimed at maintaining the environment. I think the previous speakers talked about indigenous knowledge and certain practices which were aimed at preserving them. Now, for example, during tri-season, young girls from one village would visit another village and compete in a play called Lesokwana. And this Lesokwana was a cultural practice, or is a cultural practice, which was done or is done to call upon the rain. However, because they prefer to watch television and use their smartphones, this indigenous knowledge is slowly evaporating. Now, lessons learned. This study acknowledges that culture is dynamic and that colonialism's impact on food culture is but an example of numerous aspects of change which Basotho have had to adapt to through generations. It further acknowledges that genetically modified and exotic foods are needed for human survival, especially in light of the climate change caused by global warming. It therefore concludes that indigenous plants be reintegrated into food and medicine systems by Basotho in order to make them useful. Okay, let me just say, I think this is my last slide. This is my second last slide, so let me just wrap it up by saying, it therefore concludes that the indigenous plants be integrated. It is not the intention of this paper to denounce the use of genetically modified and exotic food, but it calls for use of indigenous food for purposes of identity and culture. Now, this conference comes at a time when Lesotho celebrates 100 years of state formation. In line with Moshesha's, philosophy of dialogue and cross-pollination of civilization, it comes at the right time. The approach proposed in this paper is not one that is inclusive. It is one that is inclusive and not exclusive. Now, perhaps we can start having deep conversations about sovereignty, decolonization, parity of esteem, food and identity, food and economic participation has to be, continued initiatives. And thank you so much for this conference. Yeah, that is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Relabitso. That was a fascinating presentation, and I can see from the questions in the comments section that both papers have really engaged our participants. So I'm looking forward to getting into our discussion time.
Okay.
Perhaps I can start off the discussion with some questions for Ms. Buda and Dr. Koetsiwe. Marika, my colleague Marika wanted to know, when you teach traditional medicine as an undergraduate course or degree, what subject modules do you cover?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think what we are doing here, just as a backdrop, we have the Bachelor of Indigenous Knowledge Systems, which is the first of its kind, registered with the South African Qualification Authority. So we've got 4 streams there in that particular undergraduate. We've got the African Indigenous Health Systems, African Indigenous Science and Technology, African Indigenous Agricultural Systems, Indigenous Arts and Culture. So the traditional medicine focus area will fall within the African Indigenous Health Systems stream. And in those particular stream, we will teach Indigenous Knowledge System students modules like, for instance, now, after our internal program evaluation, because we started this thing in 2013, so we did internal program evaluation. We're trying to also work with other relevant departments like Department of Health Sciences within the university, where we develop modules now on public health, where we'll be targeting not only university students, but also people who come from outside, who can come to learn about how we do the interface within indigenous health systems and modern health systems. So we have modules from almost first year, second year, third year, and fourth year, because it's a 4-year degree. At the fourth year, the students, they can also do their own research in their own choice of area within African health systems. So we do have a curriculum. I can share with you the curriculum just to look at it, but it's a very rich, it's one of the curriculum. I was at the architecture of that particular curriculum. So I almost know every single bits and pieces of that curriculum. Although I'm not a curriculum expert, I'm an IK researcher and expert. So I hope maybe I've covered your stuff. And I saw there's another question. Can I jump on it? I can see it on the screen.
Yeah, because I think it is connected. Thank you. So yes, I asked.
Yeah, and maybe Ms. Buda will also come to add there in terms of the challenges and what is the next step. Like as I said, the problem in South Africa and in the continent with regard to traditional medicine and the traditional healers is a question of attitude that we still have. about these people, although there's policies like Ms. Buddha have said, and how suggestions have been made around the country to integrate them in the health system. But I still believe that modern health practitioners, they still have negative attitudes about traditional health practitioners and traditional medicine. Even you can look recently around COVID-19. Everything that the government talks about in terms of COVID-19 is the intervention of the modern practitioners in terms of health system, the epidemiologists. The traditional healers and their practices are almost, secondary, and nobody talks about them, in these official platforms, except what we have heard in Madagascar and Tanzania, which they have refused blindly to use vaccines. Now, they are going to use, even myself, I work with traditional healers. In my house, I've got about 3 concoctions that I have. But you see, for me, from an institutional point of view, I think we need to have what I call the Indigenous Medicine Consortium that will have scientists, researchers, traditional healers, and other researchers who are interested in this area. So we can look at the whole area of how we can come up with innovation around the issue of traditional medicine. I can make an example about one of the scary plants which we all know in our country and in the continent, the cannabis sativa, which has been identified for years. The Bushmen, they've been using this for healing, but this plant was demonized, and even by our country, and even the traditional healers, they're still demonized. We still have what we call the Witchcraft Act in South Africa, even under this new dispensation, which was a law which was crafted in the 1950s. But you see, these laws are still in existence today. So we are working with the Department of Science and Innovation and others to find a way of how we can actually come up with innovations that come from traditional medicines, not competing with the modern healers in terms of the vaccines and what, but we can offer alternatives, because I myself, I don't visit modern clinics and hospitals. I can only go there if whatever that I'm using, it doesn't work. I've got 2 boys, just to give you an example of the effectiveness of traditional medicine, who had broken bones. I have healed them with traditional medicine. Today, they are no longer using all those, whatever that they were assisting them to try and all. So you can see the effectiveness of traditional medicine. For us, these things, they don't need to be clinically trialed by anybody. They've been working for years, and we can't come up with modern scientific ways of analyzing and coming up with ways of, say, we can verify these medicines. They've been there, like my sister had been said, among them was Lesotho, they utilize these things like nobody's business. So no science in this world can verify this, because it is our science. And the next step is for us just to change our mind. There's a very basic step, because if we don't start there, we can have all these initiatives, but at the end of the day, nobody will support, because religion, education have also been part of the instruments that were used to demonize African healing systems and practitioners. So in terms of institutionalization, it is a challenge, because, like, for instance, even here at the Northwest University, we still have to work with academics who still have negative attitudes around some of these things because of their religion and whatever the world views they have. But like, as I said, when I started my presentation, I said the 1st of March in South Africa and in the world is recognized as we are remembering what we call the Battle of Adwa, which was the battle between the Italian forces and the Ethiopian forces. So it proves that victory, not only in terms of political issues, even in terms of our knowledge system, is something that we also have to look forward to in terms of how we practices for the better part. And I think COVID-19, it came us to be awake, to realize that there's a future in African healing systems, as much as the Chinese have done it, the Indians, and even modern health systems. I can talk a lot about, because I'm very passionate and I work with the healers, and I'm I prefer myself African healings because they work for me and they've been working for the people. So if one says, what is the next step? The next step for me is to bring one of the concoctions that have been developed by traditional healers that can also be used for COVID-19 going forward. And there's also other illnesses that we can also work around them using our traditional healers. So shifting of attitude, coming up with more funding, creating spaces for innovation and creativity on African healing systems. I use the example of the cannabis, which can also be used to create more employment and more benefits for the local community. Thank you there. Maybe Ms. Buddha can also jump in there. I can talk the whole day about these issues, colleagues, because
thanks, Dr. Koitsiwe. And Ms. Buddha, can I ask Ms. Buddha to maybe jump in on the question that Andries Versaghi's put to us about specifically traditional healers responding to the challenge of the coronavirus pandemic? I know that you've touched on that. Just quickly, and then we'll move on to questions for Mrs. Ralabitso.
Can you repeat that for me, please?
Andries Versaghi just wants to know, how have traditional healers responded to the challenge of the current coronavirus pandemic?
Oh, yes. You see, when it comes to COVID-19, there are so many political implications, and traditional healers are currently, pushed aside when it comes to the finding the cure or the vaccine for for COVID-19. And for now, their practices are not taken into consideration. I mean, when the news about Madagascar, when we heard about the news, so many questions were asked that, can South Africa also use their own traditional medicine as a vaccine or a cure or a treatment? And the government didn't really say much about that, but based on the pressure, there were news that they might order the vaccine or the treatment from Madagascar, because other African states were now taking orders and using it for treatment. But currently, when it comes to traditional leaders or healers taking part, I haven't seen anything of that sort. I haven't even heard the maybe some official statement from government to say this is the role of traditional healers and leaders in terms of containing and maintaining and managing COVID-19. Everything that has been said is about purchasing of COVID, of the vaccine from different companies. As we know now that there is a certain company, which I think is Johnson & Johnson, that is bringing COVID-19. And so for now, traditional healers are left aside. I don't think their traditional medicine is being considered. I mean, after they found out, there was a point where, the vaccine, or let me say the medicine used by in Madagascar, there was a time when the cases of COVID-19 increased, and people were now asking, what happened to their cure? What happened to their treatment? And that's what they didn't understand, that this was treatment for COVID-19. It was not an immediate cure. So I think lack of knowledge and lack of understanding, and what media says, people take what media says about certain things, and then they make their own conclusions. So for now, traditional leaders and traditional healers are not really considered when it comes to the treatment. So what communities do, they just go there to consult in private and getting this treatment in private. And some, like Dr. Koitsiwe said, that they are not even considering taking the vaccine. They know that they can go to a certain herbalist or a certain sangoma, and they believe that their medicine is more powerful and they can get cure from that. So these are the challenges that are currently there, that we do have policies, we do have the House of Traditional Leadership, we do have different structures, but when it comes to such issues that need indigenous knowledge, our knowledge is sidelined and is seen as old-fashioned or inaccurate knowledge. So those are the challenges that we are currently facing as the country.
Thank you so much, Ms. Buddha. And I see that Dr. Koitsiwe has just commented in the chat function that he actually has a PhD IKS candidate who's busy studying the role of African traditional healers in COVID-19. So there are people on it. If I can just jump over for the last 10 minutes to Mrs. Ralabetso. Our first question, Mrs. Ralabetso, if it's okay, I'm going to put the 3 questions to you because they do vaguely speak to one another, and perhaps you can speak generally, but obviously if you need me to remind you of the individual questions, please just ask away. So the first question from my colleague, Mr. Machoba, is, are there other reasons? So you outlined the reasons about colonial mindsets, about food culture, that GM planting is preferred to indigenous plants, but are there other reasons why GM planting is preferred? Like, is it cheaper? Is it easier? I know that you've mentioned the colonial mindsets, but perhaps you can just elaborate on that point. And then Andrea Thorpe has asked, how is the historical and contemporary situation relating to the GMO plants in Lesotho different or similar to other global situations, other previously colonized places, such as South America or Southeast Asia? And then finally, Itumeleng asks, my question, since the adverse effects of COVID-19 and now moving into the future, there's been a lot of debate about the role of museums and archives in preserving and disseminating Indigenous knowledge. As the manager, what are some of the strategies that the Royal Archives and Museum is using or plans to use to conserve and even promote the use of Indigenous plants and food crops? For example, Indigenous food or plant gardens and so on. Thank you for an interesting presentation. So our questions are about what are the reasons, perhaps you can elaborate on the reasons for preferred GM planting, what is the situation in other previously colonized countries around the globe, and finally, how is this being historicized? How is this being memorialized in a museum setting?
All right, thank you, Dr. Beth. I'll attempt to answer the question about the influence or on the preference of GM food, whether it's based on climatic condition and other factors. Well, yes, I have talked about the colonial influence on preference, but it doesn't rule out other factors which make people prefer certain plants over others due to climatic conditions. Lesotho has had in recent times, it has experienced climatic change due to global warming, and rain patterns and all the other ecological issues are not happening as they used to in the past. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of factors at play. But today I was talking about colonial legacy on preference of food, but it doesn't mean there aren't any other factors. I hope I have answered that. The second one talks about how is the historical and contemporary situation relating to GMO plants in Lesotho different or similar to other colonized places? It's actually similar. It's actually similar. The indigenous foods have been, or if you like, food culture has been negatively and perhaps to some extent positively impacted by colonial administration. So the colonized areas or colonized countries have had to assimilate food culture from foreign influence in this way being from the colonizer's side. using our indigenous plants, a lot of times we are using foreign or what was not indigenous to us as colonized spaces. So I know there are movements about decolonizing food, talking about dishes, marketability or marketing of dishes, which are not basically indigenous expressions, if you like, or local expressions. So I think there's a lot of similarity in that regard. The other question relates to the role of Royal Archives, or what strategies Royal Archives has in place to make sure that information about or indigenous preservation of indigenous knowledge. At Maharani, there are two heritage or research facilities. We have the Royal Archives, which is a sister institution to a much older Morija Museum and Archives. And in both institutions, we are promoting proper preservation, management, presentation, and interpretation of the heritage that is found within that area of Maharani. So this heritage, I mean, it's different aspects of heritage, but let's say in this context of indigenous plants, among our future plans is to have a botanical garden at Moshosho II High School, which is a school that was named after King Moshosho II. And we hope within that garden, you will find indigenous plants. Some of these plants and the samples and the documentation were donated to Royal Archives by Dr. Letsie, who is late. He was a medical doctor and also a traditional healer who was requested by King Moshosho II to conduct research on the indigenous plants. So that documentation and all the other information, we hope that we will be able to preserve it, but then also make it accessible to the public, because our core business is to then make information accessible. I hope I have answered all those questions.
I'm trying to talk while being muted. Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. I'm going to just end off with Tom Jeffrey, my colleague's question to both sets of presenters. I'm going to use our last 5 minutes for that. Dr. Coetzee, I see that the conversation is continuing in the chat function about trying to test traditional medical methods against Western testing epistemologies, which is really interesting. I think this is one of the areas where we really miss being in a physical conference space, because then, you know, you could say, please, let's continue this conversation at tea time. I'm just going to pose the final question. And if people need to leave, please do so. But we do have 5 minutes left. I can just go back and find Tom's question. Tom asks, it seems there are potential links between your work in traditional medicinal plants, and if traditional medicinal plants are replaced or displaced by GMO plants, and also where traditional plants may be appropriated by producers of modern medicine. Can you comment on such links? So links between your respective work, both presenters, and the replacement of medicinal plants with GMO plants, and whether traditional plants are being appropriated by producers of Western medicines.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I think that's a very good question, because I think there are many examples around that. Although there are potential links between these two systems, but I think, like, for instance, if you look like companies like Monsanto and other companies who are producing some of these GMOs, I think there's also what I call a threat there, which also is being posed to us as African indigenous communities, because now you see that most of these pharmaceutical companies, They are now doing research in African traditional medicine to appropriate some of these things. And then the challenge here is with regard to the intellectual property rights, because the healers, they don't know the implications of why a student comes to them to do certain research and collect information, and they disclose without signing anything with the students, and they go away with this information. This information comes as commercialized information. The intellectual property rights get taken away. But I do believe that we need to open and establish our own pharmaceutical company, because I don't think these things are very difficult to do. Like in Lesotho, there I remember I saw one of the pharmaceutical companies were established by local people, because at the end of the day, if some of these scientific interventions can be used to find a way of how it can improve on some of the technologies that are there locally, then, like for instance, if we need to have the greenhouses, to plant some of our things here and to use some of the modern technologies, I think we should be able to do that. But I think there is a challenge of modern producers and pharmaceutical companies who are actually still doing a lot of harm, because a lot of people don't know about what should be done in terms of signatures of certain information and consent forms and other things. But I believe as a country, we are going there because I'm working with the Department of Science and Innovation. We're doing public awareness of the IKS Act and the biocultural protocols in communities to teach them about some of this, because not everything well that comes from the West is bad, but I think we need to be able to understand how do we create, those potential links at the end of the day, so that we don't find ourselves like in Lesotho there, my sister, where the local communities, they are no longer eating like bomabele. They eat a lot of this pap, which are, maize, and these are some of the foods that have been, introduced to us. Like for instance, things like rice is more like our staple food, which comes from China. Well, these things are not bad, but at the end of the day, they end up, being produced for mass consumption, and that's where GMOs come, because at the end of the day, they are done for commercial purposes, and we benefit nothing from that. So there is a potential, but there are also risks with regard to some of them. To find a way of how we can eliminate the paranoia, because sometimes we've got the fear of the unknown. But also this biopiracy is a big challenge, in our communities, driven by pharmaceutical. I still believe that the access benefit sharing model is still something that we haven't yet worked around. We are working with the CSIR around how we can create the access benefit sharing model around the African ginger. Because it's one of the plants that also have been used by the healers, which we call serokolo. I grew up, my grandmother. So I'm not for GMO, but if GMOs are there and scientists argue for them, I can't say no, let them do their business. I'll go organic way of doing things.
Mrs. Rolabutso, do you have anything to add about the question of GMO and indigenous medicines? Should I take that as we've covered the area fruitfully? Carol left. Dr. Koitsiwe just says if you want that curriculum, he's left you an email address in the chat function. Perhaps you can get it there. He says George Sedupane is the coordinator of the Bachelor of Indigenous Knowledge Systems. He can help you out with the curriculum if you'd be interested in seeing it. I see Itumeling's asked another question of Dr. Koitsiwe, but we've actually run out of time. So can I close this off and thank everyone for joining us? And then I'm just going to leave the platform open for Dr. Koitsiwe to field any more questions that anyone would like to have. But I have respect for everyone's time. I understand that you might have other things on this afternoon. So I'm going to officially close the session. So thank you everybody for joining us. I think the level of engagement has really shown that it was a provocative and thank you everyone for getting involved. And if you need to leave, please do, but we're not going to close the session off just yet.
Yeah, I think also, colleague, you can share the contact of Maharani there. I think I would also like to engage with her based on some of her works and the presentation, which was also fantastic. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Manero. Really, Hama is.
Dr. Kwetsiwe, have you seen Itumeleng's question? He says.
Yeah. Itumeleng's question, he says quickly, I don't know, he says, do you think that African healing system will allow for the use of technology by African can use of modern technology innovate rather than by, I think the same questions that I've been responding to, I think in the charts that for me, I think I'll argue not for validation of one system by the other. Well, we can use modern technology, like for instance, in China, they do use modern technology. I visited South Korea 2 years ago. I found in South Korea is one of the countries which is very interesting. Everything that they have there in terms of the technology, the libraries and everything, they do it in their own language systems. And they make sure that everything that comes from their own culture is also integrated into modern technology and innovation system. But that doesn't mean that they have to now leave everything about themselves and cling to the technologies of the West. Everything they do is starts with them. Like for instance, even in terms of the language, because language is a carrier of knowledge systems. If we are unable to use our own languages in terms of the research, the teaching and community engagement on traditional medicine, then I find it's a problem. So I think we have to find a way of how we can integrate the current technology as a way of just adding value, not validation, but of how we can add value to some of these things. So it is a very big debate, this one, but I think for some of us who are in this area, we do, yes, of course, would like to open a window of acceptance and not look at indigenous knowledge systems as a panacea. It's not a solution on its own, but of course, no knowledge systems might be superior to one another. So I think integration and interfacing is a way to go. I hope I've tried to answer Itumeleng's question. But if not, you can also share with colleagues our emails, Dr. Beth. We do also have website. We're also welcome to other students who want to study with us, their masters and doctoral for research and stuff. And even for collaboration with colleagues like you from your museum. I think you are doing a fantastic work.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for getting involved. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Ms. Buda and Mrs. Rabalutso as well. Really fascinating talks. And I hope to see you all tomorrow. I hope that the platform can continue.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Beth. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.